artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hi, welcome to episode 238. Few institutions are under as much pressure today as journalism and news publishing, and AI features squarely in the middle of those pressures. Disinformation, social media, automated news generation, the list goes on, and we're talking about the fabric of our information society. Here to help us understand these issues is Neil Brown, former editor and vice president of the Tampa Bay Times, during which period they won 6 Pulitzers, and president of the Poynter Institute for Media Studies. For over 50 years, Poynter has trained journalists and protected the ethical standards of the industry through mechanisms like the International Fact-Checking Network and the Craig Newmark Center for Ethics and Leadership. Neil spent 4 decades as a journalist, launched PolitiFact.com, and was co-chair of the Pulitzer Prize Board. His mission is to strengthen democracy and confront society's most complex problems by improving the value of journalism and increasing media literacy. So we are very fortunate to have him on the show to field my very difficult questions. We're going to talk about pressures on news organizations, the evolution of the relationship between journalism and publishing, how revenue models are changing, the impact and use of AI or psychometric analysis tools, and much more. Here we go. Neil Brown, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to Artificial Intelligence and You. And I want to start out with just your perspective from very high altitude of the pressures on news organizations at the moment. What's pushing and pulling them in different directions? Where are the areas of your concern?
So the news business remains an exciting, dynamic, and really tough game. The truth of the matter is people care deeply about news and about the world around them, but they have now so many choices for how to receive that news and how to get that information that the audience is continuing to change appetites and in its behaviors, and it is served by an industry that is trying to keep up with those different changes, the different appetites, the different things that audiences value. And journalism has always sort of relied on everybody gets why this is important. We need independent information. We need credible storytelling. We need information we can trust. And for the longest time, the news organizations that have provided that, truly with excellence and with pride and with ethics, kind of just assumed a little bit that change wouldn't be as fast as it's come, and that everybody gets why it's important to democracy, and that the service that journalism and journalists were providing was a pretty much understood part of our day-to-day lives. Well, in the last 15, 20, 25 years, that has changed dramatically, but the industry itself has struggled to change with it. Partly because a lot of the news, whether it was in print or on broadcast television, radio, you name it, was sort of rooted in a business model in which advertising primarily was a great driver of revenue and allowed the journalism world to continue to do its work, and the advertising dollars, the economics, were always, they always had their challenges, but they were always pretty sound and pretty solid. Well, this fragmentation I mentioned, this change in behaviors, the reality that technology has given us so many interesting, quick, and varied ways to get news has outpaced the ability of things like advertising to keep up. And that has created such a sort of, as I said, I say exciting first all the time because I don't think we should be in a period of a posture of lament, but we should be in a posture of, wow, we got more opportunities than ever for the news that comes with new challenges for the integrity of the information and the ease of getting it and all of that. And to get to your question, Peter, ultimately, the news industry continues to try to iterate, evolve, and keep up. And a lot of times, the biggest challenge is the ability to keep up is tricky because the revenue to make those adaptations doesn't arrive as quickly as the need for the change. Does that make sense? Basically, it's a business model question.
I understand. And it reminds me of something I heard a long time ago about a possibly apocryphal, although something that no doubt happened many times in different ways, encounter between an editor and a new journalist saying, look, here's how the newspaper goes out. First, we set the advertising, then your stuff gets fit in the gaps. But I don't want to move on without calling out something you did there that is very important, which is you framed what to most people would be seen as an existential threat as a challenge. And this is a very important thing that is an undercurrent through a lot of the work that I do, that the changes, the disruptions are reflective or reflect back to us who we are and how we approach things. And so seeing disruption as negative shapes a response that is not as optimal as what you've been talking about. So my next question is, can you tell us how the relationship between news publishing and journalism, to draw that distinction, has evolved and continuing to evolve?
So you sometimes hear people say this. They'll hold up their phone and they'll say this, with this device, I can post my thoughts on social media. I can send submissions to a newsletter. I can send video to a platform. I can do a TikTok. So people will hold up their handheld smartphone device, whatever they prefer, and say, so with this, everybody can be a publisher. And that's a fair sentence. But here's my response to that. Yep, everybody can be a publisher. Not everybody can be a journalist, because there's a distinction between the distribution of the content, much of which is terrific, much of which is crap, right? We understand the volume is all out there, and everybody can distribute it, hopefully with some measure of honesty and transparency. We know I'm an idealist in that respect, I suppose. But journalism is slightly different as a concept. Journalism, at its best, certainly, and even at its basic, involves, when possible, original storytelling, original reporting, the collection of information that is then synthesized to help an audience member guide him or herself in ways that are helpful. There is an honesty and a transparency and an ethical set of guidelines around journalism, such as, I let you know where it's coming from. I don't write what you want just because you paid me to. That would not be journalism. There's a lot of ethical things. We don't doctor images, things like that are kind of core that separate journalism from just the broader world of publishing. Let me be clear, it's not an either or. People can get their information through great distribution channels that are not journalism. And I think that's one of those ways where we need to embrace change rather than lament loss, which is if people are getting information, they can get it in a number of different ways. But to your question, news publishing is a very broad environment by which we publish digital, print, broadcast, however it may be offered, as a distribution channel, maybe with a brand behind it. Journalism is the work of information gathering and then bringing it, we hope, in an accessible and honest way to people so that they can guide themselves accordingly. Of course, there is a profound overlap. News publishers publish journalism. It's just that the dynamic that you're asking about is news publishers do more than that. And journalism is guided by a series of rigorous approaches, guidelines, questions of neutrality, things like that, that separate it from anything that's simply distributed.
So, to open up a huge can of worms, that's what we're here for.
I hope.
How does investigative journalism maintain its ethical compass in a world of content being generated by literally everyone who has a phone, and sometimes not even that, who can put it out in forums where people are consuming news from social media that gives no prominence to an established, venerated organ of journalism over some trash bucket of information that has no ethics whatsoever.
Yeah. Okay, well, it's a challenge. Now, let me talk first about the concept of brand and brands. They matter, I think, even in this very adaptive and changing environment. Brands matter. Brands are earned. A brand respectability, credibility is something that should be invested in. And at the root of that would certainly be, what's the value proposition? Can I trust it? And where did you get the information? Because, without over romanticizing the concept of truth, the accuracy and the integrity of information, whether it's investigative or whether it's a brief TikTok video, matters. And I think is an opportunity to be leveraged, right? So we start with investigative journalism as something that those who do it and those who want to receive it have to view it as relevant, vital, and important. And I think if we expect the entire world to see everything that way, it's an undertaking that can't be achieved. So I started with brand because I think that there are some very traditional or long-standing brands in the world of journalism, and that some good things can and should continue to emanate from them, including those ethical guidelines that I mentioned earlier, so that what we're putting out first, not to win over every audience member out there, but to win over those who are open and receptive to the idea that journalism is rooted in telling you something you may not already know. And that once you learn it, it will still be up to you to decide what to make of it. But that investigative work involves going into places, writing stories, finding information that was not already out there, not already known. And I, the organization, with our strong brand behind it, are bringing it forth for your consideration. What makes that valuable will be A, is it accessible? And it's so complicated or boring, that doesn't help me. And B, in providing that information, has the journalistic organization, in whatever form it's offering, been very open and honest about where does this information come from, so that the audience members themselves can render their own judgments on, this is useful, this is valuable, I need to think about it. But it's not a secret, it's not a mystery. I'm not being faked out, I'm not being deceived in any sort of fashion. Now, I get we're going to talk in a moment, I'm sure, about all the possible ways that there can be deception in the putting forth of information. But investigative journalism is rooted in shining a light where there isn't any, with open, honest sourcing that explains where it came from, why it matters, and that once the audience members have a shot at listening to it, hearing it, reading it, whatever it may be, they can render their own judgments about whether it provided some value. Certainly in realms of safety, of political accountability, of all the traditional, of wartime, investigative work is taking audiences places they cannot be or go and telling them things they did not know, certainly when it's at its best. I like to think, and I like to have some optimistic view that people find that valuable, find value in that. And at the top of our conversation, I said, we need to make sure we are providing value. I think investigative journalism does that. I think if you do it and you can show your work, show your math, show where your sources came from, show where you came from, your brand, back to brand, matters, then it will have an important place in the information ecosystem. It doesn't have to have the place with everyone out there. We can go for audiences, not just a single audience for all our different work.
Thank you. And as you say, we'll be talking about the role of disinformation and AI tools in this, but I'm first establishing the environment in which all of this is operating. And how is the funding model for investigative journalism these days? Because that's a cost center, right? It's funded by
Yeah.
advertising. Someone's got to pay for a Woodward and a Bernstein to go out there and meet with Deep Throat and, dating myself here, but someone's got to pay for that and it gets returned in sales. But now, how has that changed with the internet and other ways of accessing what might fall under the heading of news? And in particular, what does that do to the model of investigative journalism by people who have been raised in this impeccable ethical standard, like the journalist I referenced there? How is that changing?
So I'll start with that part and then I'll go back to the beginning on the economic models. On that part, I really believe that the ethical fundamentals, the ethical principles that guided Woodward and Bernstein, the folks who did the Pentagon Papers, will date ourselves even beyond that, as well as the Boston Globe's work on the abuse by priests of the Catholic Church, or the investigative work that's going on at a local level right here in Tampa Bay, where we exposed in our local news organization way out of bounds levels of lead in the water in poor neighborhoods and water and air. That level of investigative work continues, and the ethical guidelines that you described, those haven't changed. Disclosure, transparency, open sources, independence, that still works. Your question is terrific from the standpoint of, and all of that work takes a lot of time, a lot of resource, is really expensive, and how do we pay for that to continue with that advertising model that I mentioned definitely diminished, if not outright broken? So is investigative journalism, local, state, national, global, is it under threat because of the costs of doing it? And the answer is somewhat. So the reality is advertising is still out there, and there are great organizations that are still getting good advertising dollars, even if they're not what they once were. And that is increasingly paying for investigative work, particularly as smaller stories are more of a commodity and can be gained almost by osmosis through social channels and things like that. So the dollars that are there for journalism often can be dedicated toward the investigative work. So advertising is still out there. A big change in the journalism industry, if you will, over the last 10 to 15 years has been asking readers to pay more. So when I talked about at the beginning, advertising funding so much, that's why news, broadcast, print, whatever it was so cheap, because advertisers were underwriting it. Now, as you know, some people even talk about subscription fatigue. We're asked to buy subscriptions to everything. And any one subscription doesn't seem that onerous, but they still add up, whether it's your streaming, whether it's your magazines, whether it's your digital websites, whatever it may be. But what it does reflect is a model shift that says, if you find value in this, you got to pony up some stuff. You got to pony up a few bucks for it. Is it valuable? It should be valuable at $10 a month. It should be valuable at $15 a month. It should be whatever it may be. And so that is not replacing the advertising dollars sufficiently, but it is helping. Asking readers to pay. That's why that work has to be good, because you know what? You can't ask people to pay for something that's no good. They're too hip to that, right? So that won't do it. The third leg of the stool, advertising and then reader revenue or audience revenue, has now become philanthropy. And whether it's grants from philanthropic foundations, whether it's membership campaigns, donors, high net worth donors, or those who care a lot about the value of journalism and democracy, many newsrooms, particularly the work in the investigative space, is now being funded through philanthropic sources. Now, let me be clear, back to point A. Ethical guidelines apply to good charitable organizations too. It's not going to do us much good if the charities that are funding the investigative journalism do so under the belief that they can guide the outcome of the stories. That level of independence has to be primary. And so, in fact, we at the Poynter Institute next year will be doing training for funders about the rules of the road. If you want to fund journalism, local or otherwise, here are the ethical guidelines that go into that work. Here is what your money is going to support. And here is where there needs to be an arm's length between it so that the audience can trust the information to be independent of the financial backing of it. And that's just an example of the kind of new environment we're in. But so investigative journalism, ProPublica is, of course, one of the best examples. That's entirely donor and grant funded. It doesn't use advertising. And they're doing investigative work all over the country and the globe, winning prizes for their good work, entirely supported through philanthropy. They're very open about who their donors are. Very open. Transparency is a component here. But I promise you, the ethical guidelines around their work or around the work of 60 Minutes, which is probably an advertising-based example of investigative work, or the Washington Post and the New York Times, those are probably hybrids. The investigative ethical foundations haven't changed at all. Now, they've had to adapt as technology is now part of that component. Is technology expands their ability to get to market, to use data, to do just amazing world-class visuals. That's expensive work too. And so the ethical guidelines that guided those two reporters that you referred to, Woodward and Bernstein, going through the Library of Congress cards one by one, and now they can do it on data sets through all kind of search engines and tools. But the foundations, the ethics behind it are the same. And they have to be articulated and they have to be honored. So I hope I got to the answer to your question there.
No, thank you. And that gives us a lead into talking about technology here and its effects. I want to talk about psychometrics and its role in, of course, disinformation. But, if it bleeds, it leads has been a mantra for a time preceding the internet. And we've always had certain organizations that would say, let's go stab this thing a few more times so that it bleeds even more. And now there are organizations whose job is to gather as many eyeballs as possible, think BuzzFeed, and completely operationalize the business of doing that down to the level of what word, what punctuation, what image will get us the most clicks. Have the traditional, more ethics-based news organizations fought back in any way in terms of using that same technology, which is now able to give us insights into what choice of language and other things, all down to the fonts and placements and so forth, get more clicks, get more readers? Are they doing anything of that, anything like A/B testing? Or to what extent does that kind of psychometric testing, to give it the most grand title, play a part in the publishing of traditional news media?
So if it's okay, I'll sort of pick that apart a little bit. First, let's talk about the sort of, let's call it business posture of the demand for clicks and audience, right? So the news environment, no doubt, I talked earlier about a little bit slow to adapt to change and to behavior. And then when it realizes, either through a loss of revenue, loss of audience, through traditional means, different changes in behavior, it jumps with both feet into the get all audience at all costs almost. Clicks, clicks, clicks. I get it. We want eyeballs on our work. And it throws off some advertising revenue online. And so audience growth, any eyeballs seem to be an approach. And like the things, we did it here. I mean, no sanctimony on any of this, right? You're trying everything you can to win over audiences that are changing on you right before your eyes, and you want to be relevant to them. The problem is, initially, we didn't do any of sort of the behavioral analysis or the audience analysis or the audience metrics you're describing, and just thought, just get any eyeball, a little bit of the TV leads it bleeds kind of mentality, because that was quick in And so you'd have like these mugshots sites. So we did them, like anybody arrested, their mugshot was online, and you couldn't believe all the clicks. People at their lunch hour just watching, the jail mugshot things. Oh, I think I know them. Or, oh, did you see what they got arrested for? All of that. And we did it, and a few things happened. Initially, audiences weren't way up, but the advertising dollars were puny, and it didn't really pay for anything. And then eventually you start to erode the character and the brand of your product because you would put pretty much anything on there, right? And, within reason. So the sort of ratings game, if you will, the clicks at all costs kind of was out there for a while, threw off some dollars initially, and then ran a course where it was hurting your brand, ultimately for very little dollars, right? The value of clicks continues to be a point of question and debate, sometimes high, sometimes not even pennies. And the calculation about whether cheesy crap that gets a lot of eyeballs is hurting your brand more than it's giving you revenue to support the very credible journalism you want to put out is a phase we're never out of, but kind of happened and has been sort of cooled. Frankly, cooled in favor of let's find people who will actually pay us for a subscription in the way I described before. But secondarily, though, I should say that desire for clicks did evolve in a way that made some sense, where we're trying to understand a little bit more, well, who are you all? And what are your interests? And what are your behaviors? So the idea of the quality, maybe quality is a bit of a loaded word, but sort of the sense of the engaging the audience to know a little bit more who they are, what their interest is, what would work for them to stay involved with your journalism in whatever form you're giving it, is where a lot of the work continues to go and is yet to crack the code, to be honest, but at least involves understanding the audience rather than just volume plays. And in that sense, it's useful to get information. Again, 3 generations ago, they gave you their address and told you to bring it to their house. So you knew what their house looked like, you know who they are, you knew what their credit score was, all of that sort of thing. This is harder because a lot of audience members, a lot of that material is protected, properly so. And so understanding who your audience is and what they want, I do think it's okay to begin to use these very powerful tools to understand them if you do that in the way that figures out, if I understand you, I can serve you better. If I serve you better, you'll find value. And if you find value, we'll get a long-term economic relationship going. That's a little bit of a longer play, but that's where the news organizations are doing more. They're doing a little bit better. It's still a very hard road. Why? In part because of that fragmentation I mentioned before, that there's so many choices and they're and there's some of them are really cheap and all of that. But I think that the sort of psychometrics and the use of audience information to serve the audience can intersect positively and needs to be embraced if we're going to continue to provide value as well as iterate some new and interesting economic models that people will pay for.
And it would have to be addressed with the same ethical standards that journalism has demanded of itself all along.
Completely. I think you have to embrace those ethical standards and find ways to set yourself apart from those that don't follow those.
When I look at my own impulses with respect to subscriptions, and this certainly applies just to national and international news, it would be a different formula at local levels. But for national and international news, when a news outlet is asking for subscriptions, my thinking about that, my impulse about that is driven less by, do I want to continue accessing this without the nagging, and more by, is this something that I want to continue in the world, that I want to see their viewpoint, their commitment continued to be protected. And obviously there's a political slant to that, and I've got no embarrassment about that. There are organizations where I would make donations if I could to get them to shut up, InfoWars, and it being, that's a sort of one end of the spectrum. Do you see this happening? How much of subscriptions do you think are driven by ideological fealty?
I would say a big chunk of subscriptions, and I'll even add the word membership as a, form of it. Is it driven by politics or partisanship? I think plenty of it is. And let me add, and that's fine, right? So I think one of the challenges as we sort of wrestle with finding new models for news against an environment of partisanship, polarization, disinformation, is that even as we're sorting out very tricky and frustrating business dynamics, we shouldn't scold the audience. That the audience is making some judgments, some collectively, some just very individually, because something is meeting their need. So I think if you buy a subscription or if you make the judgments you made, on one level, you're making it like, I'll pay you to go away. Another one, I want you to survive somehow, even if I don't read you all the time, or even if I don't have the time for you. That is a very good and honorable and legitimate judgment. And I do think that one of the media industry's challenges is to kind of not only look what it's immediately in front of their face or immediately in the moment. So if you started to take your own subscription and membership behavior and say, over the next year to 2 years, I'm going to support these organizations and test them and try them and find some value in them. And some of it may be partisan, and some of it may be just straight up accessibility or interest, and some of it may be a little exploration, because I've got the capacity to absorb or be interested in information. I used to say when I worked at the newspaper, like, I don't really care. I was an investigative guy, I was a politics reporter, all of it. And I would tell people all the time, if you told me the only reason you took the newspaper back in the day was because of the crossword, I give you a big hug still. It's okay. News and media consumption has always been around creating opportunities for serendipity. Well, you can't create that if you don't have the subscriptions to come across the story you never thought you'd read, or the viewpoint you never thought you'd like, or the viewpoint you wound up hating, but now you're intrigued. Create, where possible, an environment full of opportunity to be taught, opportunity to be validated, if that's what matters, opportunity to be surprised. And that adds up to a media environment that we should be embracing, and then having to make sure we who run different news organizations, did you create something interesting that people found of some value today? And maybe they'll do it again, and maybe they'll support it. And if they don't support it now, maybe they'll support it down the road. Instead of making everything, the single transaction is the referendum on the future. And that's where I think I recognize that's a bit, again, maybe a bit idealistic. But I do think that rather than either over-celebrate or over-criticize ourselves for each transaction, can we begin to find ways to support interesting content offered in interesting ways that's relevant and serviceable, that people are willing to keep trying for a while, and that we can adapt as we get to know them better. And I do think getting to know that audience better is key. And that's where certainly some of the tools that you've talked about on your own program and stuff, these things can be very helpful. They certainly can provide all kind of anxiety and are fraught. But it's always been a fraught environment when you're talking about content and ideas and people's thinking. So you got to be willing to play in that environment.
Thank you. That's the end of the first half of the interview. I'm really enjoying this conversation with a statesman of journalism. In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, and very much in keeping with our current interview, a paper in the journal Science explored whether dialogues with generative AI could convince people to abandon beliefs in conspiracy theories. Having lost people close to me to the mire of conspiracy theories, this is very important to me. And we know that it is incredibly difficult to change the minds of people who have been sucked into that mire. The word impossible comes to mind. But the conclusion of the research, in the paper titled Durably Reducing Conspiracy Beliefs Through Dialogues with AI, was that the AI chatbot's ability to sustain tailored counterarguments and personalized in-depth conversations reduced participants' beliefs in conspiracies for months, challenging research suggesting that such beliefs are impervious to change. Well, it's certainly a challenging idea, especially given the methodology. Human participants described a conspiracy theory that they subscribed to, and the AI then engaged in persuasive arguments with them that refuted their beliefs with evidence. I can tell what you're thinking. I, for one, would not have expected any approach based on persuasive evidence-based arguments to succeed. And clearly there's got to be some selection bias inherent here. I mean, how many conspiracy theorists are also going to be willing to help university researchers of any kind? But these researchers at MIT and Cornell say conspiratorial rabbit holes may indeed have an exit. And they tested this with industrial-strength conspiracy theories like the JFK assassination, aliens, the Illuminati, and COVID-19 and the 2020 US presidential election. So, this is encouraging. And great acclaim awaits anyone who can do this at scale. Next week, we'll conclude the interview with Neil Brown, when we'll talk about the use of AI in journalism, in writing stories, its effect on our writing standards, different levels of stories in journalism, and the potential use of AI in interactive news publishing. That's next week, on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.